The first crack of the whip sounded like thunder through the silent square, and by the second, nobody looked away. Lydia didn't scream. Not because it didn't hurt, but because her child was somewhere in that crowd. Her wrists were bound to the hitching post outside the courthouse, her back exposed to sun and judgment alike, and each lash burned through not just skin, but years of carefully hidden truth. The sheriff read from a crumpled list, accusations wrapped in righteousness, defiance, miscegenation, harboring fugitives, abandonment of womanly duty. She had lived quietly for 7 years at the edge of town, washing linens, baking bread, never drawing attention, until someone had seen the child, a boy, dark-eyed, wild-haired, too fast for his age. They'd cornered her outside the bakery. "Where'd you steal him from?" one man had sneered, and before she could speak, the boy had vanished into the alleys. Now, as the whip cracked again, Lydia's knees buckled and blood soaked the back of her dress. Still, she refused to collapse. If they wanted shame, they wouldn't get it from her spine. The crowd murmured, a mix of disgust, curiosity, and that particular hunger that fed on someone else's ruin. Women who'd once bought her pies now whispered behind parasols. A preacher's wife clutched her daughter tighter. The town mayor stood with arms folded, nodding solemnly like this cruelty was a civic duty. Then the boy's voice tore through the silence like lightning. "That's my mother!" Every head turned, including the sheriff's. The whip froze mid-air. From the crowd, a boy no older than 7 broke through, a blur of motion, bare feet, hair tangled, eyes ablaze with a fury bigger than his frame. He stopped in front of her, arms spread wide like a shield, breathing hard, defiant. "Her name's Lydia," he shouted, "and she didn't steal me. I came out of her." Gasps rippled outward. The sheriff blinked, unsure if he should laugh or strike, but the moment had cracked the spell. Lydia's chin lifted. "His name is Coda," she rasped, voice broken but clear, "and if any of you touch him, I will rise again just to haunt you." The silence was absolute. Even the sun seemed to hold its breath. The sheriff stepped back like he'd been struck, the whip dangling useless in his hand as murmurs surged through the crowd like wind before a storm. A Lakota boy? Her child? Lydia felt Coda's fingers slip into hers, sticky with dirt and sweat, anchoring her to something solid amid the dizzying heat and judgment. "Get the boy out of here," someone muttered from the back, but no one moved. The mayor cleared his throat, trying to wrest back control. "This isn't about the child," he announced. "It's about law." But law, Lydia knew, had always bent around fear, and the town feared what they couldn't explain. A white woman who'd vanished for a season, then returned with a boy who looked nothing like any man they approved of. They feared her silence, her independence, her refusal to confess when cornered. But the truth had always lived inside Coda's face. His high cheekbones, the way he watched animals before speaking, the instinct to run not out of fear, but understanding. His father had been named Chayton, and he had died before Coda learned to walk. A fire had taken him, a fire set by these same men who now stood slack-jawed in judgment, unaware that their cruelty had already made orphans once before. Lydia had never told Coda the full story. She hadn't known how. But now, with her back raw and her secret shouted into daylight, she realized she no longer had the choice. "My son's father was Lakota," she said, loud enough for them all to hear. "And he died saving your cattle from the blaze you blamed on his people." Several men stiffened. One stepped forward. The blacksmith, a thick-armed man who'd once flirted with Lydia before she wore grief like armor. "So you lay down with a savage," he spat. Coda flinched. Lydia didn't. "I lay down with a man who kept me warm when winter nearly killed me, a man who taught me to listen before speaking, A man who carried me when I couldn't walk." Her voice didn't shake. "And you? You call yourself civilized because you have a church and a gallows." That landed like a stone in a still pond. The blacksmith's fist curled, but he didn't swing. Because the boy was still standing there. Because maybe, for the first time, they weren't sure who the real savage was. They would have moved on her again, if not for the sound of hooves. One horse, then two, then a dozen. The sheriff turned, his hand instinctively hovering near his belt, but the riders bore no weapons, only expressions unreadable, solemn, dust-covered. At the front rode an elder Lydia hadn't seen in nearly 8 years. His braids were silvered now, his face carved deeper by wind and age, but she knew him the moment he dismounted. "Tyann," she whispered, her voice cracking. Coda stared, wide-eyed. "That's my uncle." Lydia nodded. Tyann approached slowly, not as a warrior but as a witness. He looked once at the whip discarded in the dirt, then at the boy, and finally at Lydia's bleeding back. Then, without a word, he removed his outer robe and draped it around her shoulders. The gesture was simple, but it shattered the town's pretense like glass. "You come into our town uninvited," the mayor said, puffing his chest. "You think that boy makes a claim?" Tyann turned to him, unmoved. "That boy is Chayton's blood. That woman kept him safe when we could not. We come to honor her, not to beg permission." The townsfolk stiffened. Some stepped back. A few reached for rifles that hadn't been needed in decades. Lydia's heart pounded, not from fear, but from clarity. It was no longer her secret to bear. Tyann gestured, and one of the riders stepped forward with a satchel. From it, he pulled a wrapped bundle and unfolded it gently before the crowd. A baby blanket, sun-faded, titched with symbols that mirrored those tattooed along Coda's wrist. Proof. Tyann didn't explain it. He didn't need to. Lydia straightened beneath the weight of the robe. "This boy is not a problem to solve. He is a bridge you never asked for." The sheriff glanced at the mayor, unsure now which direction the wind was blowing. "Let her go," someone murmured in the crowd. Then another voice. "She's done nothing wrong." The crowd began to break, not in chaos, but in shame. Tyann turned to Coda and offered his hand. Coda looked to Lydia. She nodded. The boy took it, fingers trembling. They weren't just witnessing a reunion. They were watching a history rewritten in real time by a boy, a whip, and a name no one could erase. Lydia's heart had always been torn between two worlds, but standing there, with her son in Tyann's arms, the weight of the past suddenly seemed lighter. The crowd dispersed, murmuring, but the town was still silent in the shadow of what had just been revealed. Tyann turned to her with eyes full of unspoken words. "Come with us," he said gently, but Lydia hesitated. "I can't," she whispered, barely audible. "They won't forget me. Not here, not ever." Tyann nodded, his gaze understanding but unwavering. "They will remember you, yes, but in their own time. For now, we need to go." Coda pulled at her sleeve, his voice small but filled with urgency. "Mom, let's go." The word mom still sounded foreign, but it felt right now. Lydia turned to face the town square for one last time. The mayor stood, still stunned by the force of Tyann's presence, but now there was something different about him. The shame in his eyes was almost palpable, like he had seen something he hadn't wanted to see. "It's not the way we do things around here," he muttered, but his voice lacked the conviction it had held before. Lydia didn't reply. There was no need. The damage had been done long ago, and nothing would change until the town was ready to accept the truth. As she walked past the sheriff, she caught a glimpse of his hardened face, but even he didn't stop her. She wondered, briefly, if the realization of what had just occurred would settle like dust, unnoticed until it was too late. The ride back to Tyann's camp was a blur. Coda nestled in the crook of her arm, clutching the blanket with trembling fingers. The sun hung low in the sky, casting the land in an amber hue that felt like an apology. Tyann remained silent, his presence a calm anchor in the tumult of the day. But Lydia could feel the weight of what was coming. Not the end of the journey. No, that would come later. But the beginning of something that couldn't be undone. The day had changed everything, and they would never be the same again. The Lakota camp sat nestled between the red cliffs and the cottonwoods, glowing with the last light of day. Lydia had only been here once, years ago, hidden by nightfall and urgency, when Chayton had led her across the river under a blanket of stars and silence. Now, she entered not as a secret, but as someone claimed. The children ran barefoot among the tents, their laughter soft as the rustle of wind through reeds. No one stared at her. No one asked questions. Coda clung to her at first, but when an elder woman offered him a carved wooden animal, he stepped forward, curiosity outweighing caution. Tyann led Lydia to the fire circle, where the oldest members of the band waited. Not warriors, but women with lined faces, and men whose eyes held years. One woman reached out and gently touched Lydia's arm. "You kept his flame," she said. "Now we will help carry yours." Lydia didn't understand all the words, but she felt their meaning settle in her chest like warm bread. They weren't welcoming her out of obligation. They were folding her into something older than law or blood. Tyann spoke softly, explaining to the circle what had happened in town. Not in anger, but in truth. She stood against them, he said, but she should not have stood alone. A slow nod passed from person to person like the passing of a torch. A man named Enepai, with skin like weathered leather and eyes like smoke, lifted a bundle from beside him. Inside was a shawl, deep red, edged with beadwork so fine it shimmered in firelight. "This was Chayton's mother's," he said. "It was meant for his wife. He chose her." Lydia reached out, hands trembling as the woman who had first touched her draped it over her shoulders. It was not a ceremony. It was something quieter, deeper. Coda watched, still holding the wooden animal. Then he whispered, "Do I have a name here?" The circle turned to him. Tyann smiled. "You have the name your father gave you, and now you will have the one we give you together." Lydia felt her throat close. Not from fear, but from the terrible, beautiful realization that this child who had been a secret his whole life was finally being seen. And she, for the first time, was not hiding. The naming fire was different from the cooking flames or the warmth of the circle. It was built low and steady, fed with specific herbs and woods that cracked in ways Lydia had never heard before. Tyann sat across from Coda, a feather in one hand, a line of red ochre drawn across his own brow. Around them, the others had formed a silent ring, not to witness, but to lend weight. Coda sat straight, legs crossed, eyes wide but still. Lydia knelt just behind him, unsure if she should stay or step away, but when her hand began to slip from his shoulder, Coda reached back and gripped her fingers. "Stay," he whispered. Tyann nodded without looking up, as if the boy's soul had just passed its first test. "The fire knows him," he said, scattering dried sage into the flames. "We do not give names. We listen for them." The smoke curled upward, dancing, revealing nothing to Lydia's eyes, but something stirred in the faces of the elders. Tyann's voice fell into rhythm, half chant, half prayer, and the wind stilled like it was listening. Then, softly, he spoke. "He will be called Mapiaka," he said, "cloud that stays." There was no applause, no smile, just quiet agreement, like a bell had rung in the spirit world. Coda turned to Lydia. "Cloud that stays?" he echoed. She nodded slowly, her voice breaking. "It means you're not going anywhere, baby. Not anymore." The circle slowly dispersed, but not away. From her, they moved through, brushing her shoulder, squeezing her hand, bowing their heads slightly, letting her know, "You are not alone now." Tyan placed a hand on her shoulder. "Tomorrow," he said, "we speak of your place here." Lydia met his eyes. "You think there's a place for me?" He looked down at Coda, who now tossed the wooden animal into the air and caught it with both hands. "You made it yourself," Tyan said. "We are only asking if you'll stay inside it." That night, Lydia lay beside her son in a tent smelling of cedar and earth. Coda's breathing steadied. His hand found hers in the dark. And in the stillness, she finally allowed herself to believe it. They were safe. Morning came with the scent of wild mint and wood smoke, and for the first time in years, Lydia did not rise in fear. She watched Coda sleep, his face soft in the pale light, arms flung out like he'd never been chased, never heard shouting behind him. The shawl still clung to her shoulders, its beadwork cool against her skin. Outside, a low murmur of life moved through the camp. Women grinding corn, men returning from early hunts, children running barefoot through tall grass. Lydia stepped out into it, blinking. She expected eyes on her, judgment, hesitation, but what she received was a nod, a smile, a bowl of berries placed gently in her hands by a girl no older than Coda. Tyan met her at the far fire, where water boiled in a blackened pot. "You'll help at the river today," he said, as if she'd always belonged here. "You'll walk with Chenoa. She'll show you the herbs." Lydia didn't ask why. She only nodded. Chenoa was soft-spoken, but sure-footed, with braids down to her waist and a voice like quiet thunder. As they moved along the riverbank, she pointed to plants by their real names, names Lydia had never heard. "This one stops bleeding," Chenoa said, crouching. "This one teaches your stomach to behave." Lydia touched each plant with reverence, as if memorizing not just medicine, but belonging. When they reached the bend in the river, Chenoa stopped. "You stood in front of the lash," she said without turning. "I saw it in your back." Lydia swallowed. "I didn't want him to see me fall." Chenoa nodded. "You didn't." Then she handed Lydia a stone jar. Inside was a thick salve, dark green and pungent. "For tonight, your scars will speak. Let them speak softer." They worked in silence, side by side, the way women did when trust was still growing but real. When they returned, Coda ran to her, hands stained with berry juice. He grinned so wide his cheeks nearly split. "I helped make fire," he said proudly. Lydia pulled him close, heart full to the brim. She wasn't a settler, wasn't Lakota. But here, between what was burned and what was blooming, she was becoming something else entirely, and they were letting her. They saw the dust before they saw the rider. One figure on a sorrel horse, moving slow, too steady to be fleeing but too alone to bring good news. Lydia stood just outside the cook fire, Coda at her hip, instinct rising like heat in her chest. Tyan emerged from his tent without a word, joined by Enepe and 3 others. The rider dismounted at the edge of the camp and removed his hat. It was the sheriff. He looked older already, worn down not by distance but by shame. "I'm not here to bring her back," he said, eyes on Lydia. "I just came to say something." Tyan's stance didn't relax. "Then speak it." The sheriff swallowed. "I was raised to believe lines were there for a reason. Town folk here, your kind there. But that boy's voice, what he said, I heard it in my bones. He looked at Coda now. He made me remember that my mother once helped a Lakota woman give birth in our barn. We never spoke of it again. Lydia didn't know what to say. The sheriff turned to her now. I was wrong. About you. About what you were hiding. You weren't hiding shame. You were protecting something sacred. Tyan's voice was low but firm. And now... The sheriff exhaled, his hands shaking slightly. Now I'm here to say I stepped down, gave my badge to someone with fewer ghosts, and I left something for the boy. He reached into his saddlebag and drew out a small wooden box. Inside was a carved compass, old and worn, etched with initials. It was mine when I was a child. My mother said it always pointed me where I needed to be, even when I didn't know it. He offered it to Coda, whose eyes lit up, unsure but drawn to it. This doesn't make anything right, the sheriff added, but maybe it says something can start over. Tyan stepped aside just enough to let the man pass. The sheriff walked forward, knelt, and placed the compass in Coda's hand. Then he stood, nodded once to Lydia, and turned back toward the trail. As the sound of hooves faded, Lydia looked at her son, who held the compass like it glowed. Where do you think it's pointing? He whispered. Lydia smiled faintly. Home. They settled at the edge of the creek where the land didn't belong to the town, and didn't belong to the tribe either. It had once been hunting ground, then cattle land, then abandoned after a harsh winter drove the settlers out. Now, it belonged to no one, and that made it perfect. Tyan helped build the walls, but Lydia planted the floor. Not wood or stone, she laid herbs, crushed flowers, scattered cedar shavings that turned the cabin's scent into something alive. Coda painted symbols he'd learned from both worlds, Lakota spirals and settler suns, childlike but proud. He grew fast in those months, legs stronger, laughter louder, scars from memory fading like morning frost. Every few weeks, Genoa brought medicine and stories. Sometimes children from the village came and sat by the fire, listening to Lydia read from worn books they'd never seen before. In return, they taught Coda how to make rabbit traps and climb trees without being heard. He was becoming more than she ever imagined, more than either world had expected. Lydia baked bread for trade, learned to stitch leather, began to speak the Lakota words slowly, like songs she was only just remembering. One night, as the wind curled warm through the open window, Coda stood at the doorway, holding his compass. It pointed here, he said. Lydia looked up from the hearth. What do you mean? He smiled. I asked it if we were home. It pointed here. She crossed to him, kneeling beside his growing frame. Home isn't just where we sleep, she said. It's where people come back to. That night, someone did. The sheriff's hat appeared first, on a bundle left at their steps. Inside was cloth, salt, and 3 hand-carved figures, a woman, a boy, and a tall man with braids. No note, just acknowledgement. Lydia held the figures and felt no anger, only release. Coda placed them on the shelf above the fire, arranging them carefully, eyes shining. That evening, as they sat under the open stars, Lydia realized the silence wasn't emptiness anymore. It was peace. They hadn't returned to the town. They hadn't disappeared into the tribe. They had built something in between. And in that space, neither claimed nor borrowed, their story would root itself like a tree unbothered by fences. Spring found them near the river fork, where willows bent low enough to touch the water, and Lydia's voice finally sounded like it belonged outside again. Her days passed in rhythm. Firewood in the morning, bread by noon, teaching Coda letters in the light that slanted through the cabin window. He had grown taller, his hair longer, his speech a dance between 2 languages. He called her Aina now, not out of obligation. but instinct. The word for mother came easy. It made her chest ache in the best way. One afternoon, Tyan arrived with a carved figure of a bird and a quiet smile. He sat for tea, but said little, only watching the land around her like someone taking measure. As he rose to leave, he placed the bird in Coda's palm. "For your circle," he said. "Every family builds theirs in time." Then he turned to Lydia and offered a single nod that carried more weight than 1,000 apologies. She watched him ride until the trees swallowed his shadow. Life moved in soft waves after that. The townsfolk never came, not in hate, not in curiosity. But once, Lydia saw a girl from the bakery walk by the edge of the woods with her father. The girl waved, uncertain but unafraid. Lydia waved back. One quiet night, as firelight flickered on the walls and rain tapped gently on the roof, Coda asked the question she hadn't prepared for. "What was his name?" Lydia turned from the fire, the carved figures casting long shadows beside her. "Your father?" He nodded. She took a breath. "Chaitin. It means falcon." Coda sat in silence, then repeated it. "Chaitin." The word felt like an offering, a thread pulled through time. He whispered it once more and tucked himself into his blanket. Lydia sat alone for a moment after he slept, watching the flames dance. She traced her fingers over the shawl still wrapped around her shoulders. Outside, the river kept speaking in its ancient voice. In that flickering hush, Lydia felt no bitterness, no fear, only belonging. She had carried her truth through fire and blood and silence, and now it had a home, a boy, a name, a circle that would never break. Please like, share, and subscribe for more true-hearted tales here on Echoes of the West. If you'd stood in that square and heard the boy cry, "That's my mother," would you have stepped forward too? Tell us in the comments.